All right. Welcome to first episode of Out of the Fire podcast. And this is Eugene Vestel and Grahame Grieve, the founder of FHIR. Grahame, welcome to the podcast. This is going to be a really short one probably today because I think you're on Australian time and you've been traveling a lot, so you probably are pretty tired. But hopefully we'll have a great conversation about FHIR here. It would be great if we could just get started with how did FHIR come about and how did you get involved with it? How did you get into this space?
Well, I mean, there's two sides to the answer. There's why FHIR and there's why me. I started FHIR because it was clear 15 years ago, 14 years ago, really. 14 years ago, it was clear that all of the plans we had for the future for how data should be exchanged was beginning to be what we needed, given what was obviously coming. I mean, we could see AI coming, although it suddenly arrived as a rush at the end, but we could see a tidal wave of desire for data exchange. And the choices that we had just weren't up to scratch. And I had worked myself up to chair of the relevant committees and so forth, but it was clear that we weren't going to move the needle. And so I had an opportunity where I needed to just clear the deck. So I just pushed everything on the table and said, if we were to start again, what would it look like? What is, looking at the best practices around the web, what would we have? And so I started again best practices, both in terms of standards and interoperability and data exchange and tech and so forth, and drafted something. This is a draft still available on the FHIR website. And then we just, developed it iteratively from there. And why me? Because at the end of the day, it was a values decision for me. I want to live in a world where my family gets connected healthcare, where I can get consistent, reliable healthcare, and we don't have to keep having a healthcare reset every time you move from institution to institution. And someone's going to do it, and there was no one better in the world situated than me to do it. So I decided to have a go. I had no idea it would be such a big deal, or maybe I wouldn't. But I'm rewarded by the size and the activity of the community and the changes that we've made and the outcomes that we've brought about has been worth it from my point of view.
That's really great. Why do you think, Grahame, that at that point you felt like you had the power to do this and you thought that you were going to be successful, that you can be the person that does that?
I didn't know that I thought I was going to be successful, but I thought that I could have a go. I was chair of the relevant committees and had the ears of some people whose decision-making mattered. And I didn't have any idea what success even meant then. I think we envisaged when I first started it as just another standard, and it hasn't turned out that way. So we just built it without really understanding what it meant to build it. And here we are. So I don't know that I thought this, but I thought that I thought I had more chance than anyone else starting from within the system. If you go back and look at what we were at the start, there was a bunch of people who were trying to write healthcare APIs who thought they weren't connected with the problems. They had this rosy view of the healthcare system and both as a data problem and as a industry and a community problem. And they thought they could just write something that made sense to them without having to face up to the dreadful stuff that goes on in healthcare, some of which is necessary and some of which is not. And I knew that at least I had the connections and the understanding of why things are so screwed up in healthcare, that I could actually write something that was, coherent and possible, even if it's messier than everybody wants. So I guess there was that, and indeed that's what we've got with FHIR. FHIR is messier than a lot of people want. And, I was just in Amsterdam last week at a conference, FHIR Dev Days conference, and this theme that's run through FHIR from the beginning is still strong and it still causes lots of contention, is are we building a healthcare data platform or are we building a interoperability specification for the existing healthcare system? And, those are not the same thing, but, and there's a tension between the two. But we've always said from the beginning that we are building an interoperability spec for the system as it is to use. And if people want to adapt that to be a health data platform, that's good. But there's no point in us building a health data platform that doesn't deal with the healthcare system that we have. anybody could design a really nice API. Anybody, you could design a really nice API if you didn't think that we had to bring all our legacy data forwards. But if you go to a hospital and say, well, first of all, you start by toasting all your existing data and your records, healthcare records, it's dead in the water. There's no possibility of that. It has to come forwards. And that's made our job significantly more complicated and the outcome significantly more messy. But also it means that we have a pretty good requirements gathering process. You can go anywhere in the world and know that it's going to work. It's not unrealistically simplified. I think that's worth outcome. But it's certainly the tension between those two things that people who are trying to develop a health data platform find unnecessarily complicated. And we had a huge argument last week about breaking change, where we shouldn't allow breaking change. But what are you going to do when the government comes along and a new president says, well, we're simply going to change the way we operate, everyone has to change. You can't go to the president, oh, actually, that's not backwards compatible, so it's not possible. It's not a discussion that happens, right? And so you have to deal with these political things that happen at every level all around the world and say breaking change is possible and allowed and painful, and we can't stop that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point that you're making, that you can't stop the breaking changes. And what is your view on that in terms of, I've heard that from people before in terms of FHIRs, it's either we were going to make it very, very specific, or we were going to make it specifically broad so that people can adopt and grow. What is your view on that in terms of, I guess they call that the normative versus the trial, and should normative resources change over time? I don't understand how you can prevent changes happening, period. As things grow, even as humans get, new discoveries are made in healthcare. Is healthcare going to be practiced the same way over time? Probably not. But can you build a structure where more or less things are relatively standardized over time?
We have a process whereby we develop things iteratively. We put up a candidate and people try it and give us feedback. And you can watch any piece of the spec go through that cycle where it turns out there were things we didn't know, we didn't consider, and the tension that, where we draw the line and the compromises we take turn out to be less than optimal in ways that we care about. For sure, it's less than optimal. But over time, it settles. And over time, we converge to stability. As enough people have tried it, and then in the end, you start going, well, it's stable. So we're going to, go for some hack workarounds and whatever. And you do get to that point. But healthcare itself doesn't actually change. Like biology isn't changing, healthcare's not changing. AI's arrived with a bang, but it was always obvious that we were going to get smart computing devices. They're not new. Since I qualified at uni 30 years ago, probably the biggest changes in like the notional change in actual healthcare. Although everything continues to get better, it's always linear and in the path. I identify epigenetics as the single biggest thing that we didn't know about. When I was at uni, it simply was not a thing. And now epigenetics is more than just a thing, right? It's huge. But even so, even genomics, which is the fastest moving area, it's still stable. So we can get to stability. I think that we didn't understand, or maybe I didn't understand, maybe it's my fault, we didn't understand. We have this process where we try and iteratively get towards stability, and we haven't figured out how to reconcile the market with that, because we put release 4 out. That was 6 years ago now. 7 years ago. We were very much still in the learning phase, and the industry's just gone ahead and gone with it. And then you look at it, and I get feedback all the time saying, can you just it's fine. But then you look at the actual tasks, the actual issues people have had, and you go, it's not fine, it's not good, we can't stop there. The issues that people have raised are genuinely important, fundamental issues with things that we got wrong, and they do deserve being addressed. And yes, that's painful. But then the counterpoint is, well, if you're what you're trying to do is publish at the end of next year the copy, right? And after that, we will only make non-breaking changes. The sort of things like we've already got a little bit of this patient where we realised that we really need secondary addresses or additional addresses for patient contacts. So we just added additional addresses. It's messy, right? Instead of making addresses repeating. It's messy, but you could do stuff like that. And there will always be some pain and some things where you just go, oh, that's just really painful, but we'll have to figure a workaround somehow or other. They almost always can. And so it's a trade-off. And the committees are looking, at the tasks coming and going, but this stuff is really, really big deal. We're not going to be ready, but we'll never be ready if you take that attitude. And so it's about trying to choose, what's the least worst compromise between changing and always changing and keeping changing and not changing and just sucking it up and going, there's things that we're just never going to fix. And at the moment, the market feedback is pretty strong, but we really need stability. And there's lots of people who are happy. The basic rule of thumb is the changes I want are changes you need to make immediately, and the changes I don't want are changes you can never make. Right? That's everybody's in that situation. So it's about, listening to the feedback, working with the broad community, trying to pick the least or the best compromise. Least worst compromise. There's no nirvana here. And that's kind of, the process that we're going through.
Yeah, I gotta tell you, Graham, that's one of the main things I think that I hear about FHIR in my time working with developers is just, why is FHIR so needlessly complicated? Why is it so complicated? And then the layers, I think the layers of it is where they get really, what is the difference between the base spec and implementation guides, and why you can't look at these three different profiles of a resource and you can't just program around the resource. You really have to look at what is the implementation. And I think that's where people say that the purpose of FHIR is really broad, right? And I think it's purposefully designed that way because there are so many different use cases for how you can implement, observation resource. I think supports like 10 different use cases, from labs to social determinants to all kinds of other stuff, right? So,
and that's a very difficult area, and it was something I put a lot of thought into before I started working on FHIR. But we've never seen a healthcare specification that doesn't work like that. And in fact, it's almost unique to healthcare. But if you look at any serious attempt to do healthcare data exchange, you immediately run into a conflict. Because on the one hand, you want to be specific. And I'm saying, we're going to solve the problem we're going to solve. We're going to solve it that way. And then we have a solution-specific, fit-for-purpose standard. And then you discover that that's actually one of the 10,000 sharded use cases. And so you can't apply that for the next use case over, and so you start again. And you end up with 10,000 standards, which is worse. Or you go for a platform standard, problem of layers. And that's why every one of us has ended up who's tried has taken this on. I actually did a review with the OMG with why we can't use URL in healthcare. I met with the OMG architecture board when I was planning FHIR in my head to say, can we actually, I still think we should have a URL diagram for invariance. So here's a class model and here's an instance model, but there's something in between, which is we use constantly in health, which is the set of acceptable variants of this class model. And they were looking at me and their heads were exploding going, people don't work like this. And I'm like, in healthcare, we have no choice because, on the one hand, you've got someone super specialized oncology system with their super constructed workflow for dealing with this particular cancer, this particular chemotherapy regime, and all the consequences of this particular mix, formulation that we administer to the patient. And then the data that results from that, the statements of care and consequences and observations, are critically important in every other system in healthcare. What are you going to do? You're going to have that, 10,000 structures, frameworks through all the EHRs. Not all the EHRs do what we do internally, which is one general model with lots of adaptations and sets of rules and ways of documenting and describing those. It doesn't take you long of being exposed to inpatient medicine before you realise that this is where health is always going to go. And as I said, and the pain you're feeling is exactly the same as the OMG architects who are going, people can't develop like this. I totally get that. People can't develop like this. And yet, this is health. Nobody has ever figured out an alternative. So I feel the pain. Man, I feel the pain every day.
What would you say to people that are just starting out learning FHIR?
Look, FHIR is not that hard to learn. I think it's health. Health is a thing that's just so hard, and you can learn and learn and learn and never master it. So I think that you should endeavour to have an open mind. So many people come into it going, health is like everything else, and I know everybody says this, but it just is not. And so you have to have this open mind and a way of learning the gestalt of healthcare. The other thing that's special, that's unusual, that I've never found, and so get on my hobby horse, you heard the word health informatics, right? Hear it all the time, health informatics. Do you ever hear about any other kind of informatics? Like aerial informatics or space informatics. You never do. It's a weird health thing, right? And the same for terminologies. We never move without terminologies. They're just everywhere in everything that we do. But nobody else has terminologies. It's a weird health thing we've had for centuries now. There's just some weird stuff about health that we can't seem to, like, we try to keep going, we're not special, we shouldn't be different, and then we just are. And so it's kind of like get your head around that 101s of healthcare informatics around the importance of units and variation in data representation and why it's so hard. I was talking to Don Rucker about this last week. He was the National Coordinator of Healthcare IT in previous administration, a tool ago, the first Trump administration. And he said that he thinks the reason that healthcare is fundamentally different is because you never have complete documentation. I mean, there's some other industries which are a little bit like that, but in health, you never do. You always have incomplete approximation at some, a variable amount of level. And that's one of the things for him that makes health different at the IT level. I could point to a few other things, but I'll maybe quite long.
What do you think is the one thing that FHIR has not lived up to that you thought that it would help solve, maybe?
There's probably three things. And one of them is like uber techie. I think that at the uber techie level, I wanted to have all the definitions in FHIR based on ontology. So it was a really sound ontological base, which would help boffins and reason with the spec and also tell us more proactively the bits that don't make sense. And there have been some stuff we found operationally that didn't make sense, or that we made a wrong decision, which probably wouldn't have happened if we'd been able to build a better ontological base. But in the end, I think that was a bit of a naive of me, because I was working with the best people in the world, honestly. The W3C, RDF experts and whatever. It's just really, really hard to bridge between FHIR and the underlying bio-ontologies, and really, really hard to reason at the level that I wanted to try and achieve. And so that was one way that we fell short. And I still think that it would have been better if we had got that. Another thing is that I still think we don't have a strong enough language in FHIR for talking about describing and how to deal with aggregates of resources. And almost everything involves aggregate resources groups, like a bunch of observations along with conditions and the care plan, for instance. And I don't think we still don't have good enough tools for dealing with that. We were talking about that last week. And then also, I still think that we have got work to do in helping the communities around the world proactively collaborate with each other in their little micro communities. And I think that we've dropped the ball for a few of those, like particular countries where things have developed really anarchically. The whole notion of FHIR as a community is the least worst way to solve these problems. But in some ways, we haven't brought the community to bear. And so they're dealing with a lot of self-created chaos that they could have been avoided if we'd been able to more constructively bring the community to bear. But in each of those cases, there's a whole whack of cultural and procedural and political inputs into those different communities that have led to that situation. So it's not obvious what we could have done differently, but at least in a few of them, I've looked at them and thought, really, I should have paid much more attention to this. So there's a range of things which will appeal to people differently on that.
One of the things that strikes me, though, you bring up communities. Like, one of the things that really strikes me about FHIR, I think, is that there is quite a community around it. People talk about, there's dev days, the Zulip chat, like there's other things going on where people collaborate in connectathons. What is your view of the community at FHIR? Would you call it is it a true community, or is it really people that are working on different things? Or they're working on the same thing and they're trying to implement it?
Well, I mean, it's best understood as a swarm of overlapping communities who share, a common focus of building or using FHIR or building on it. And but then each of the sub communities has their own focus and their own, way of engaging and their own degree of penetration into the community that they're dealing with. I regularly say when I'm speaking or meeting with politicians or whatever that, the focus of our assets is on the technical standards that we produce, but the genuine asset we have, the thing that's most valuable, is the community. And it's incredible how active and helpful and engaging that so many people are, hundreds of people. If you don't ask the most weirdest arcane question on, chat.fire.org, you'll answer. We don't know who you are or whatever, but that's an incredible thing. We've looked at some of the other standards at healthcare. They've looked at, what we're doing and tried to emulate that, and it's really hard. And so I just feel really lucky that it has come about. And as I said, it's the best asset we have, that you can get help and that the community won't, punish you for asking arcane or obscure or even easy questions. Everywhere that inevitably when I end up meeting, generally I meet with senior bureaucrats, the decision maker level or advising ministers, whatever. And there's always a community locally pushing that senior decision maker going, come on, we gotta get ourselves together and start having a push to fire and building a community. They're always there locally, and that's just. And we don't have a formal marketing campaign. We don't have a formal marketing budget or strategy. We don't do marketing. The community does it for us. We can't keep up with them anyway. So, that's an incredible strength that we have. And there's always someone to help. It's amazing.
Thank you, Grahame. I know I have a ton of questions. This is the first, hopefully, out of many. One last question before we leave is, how can people get involved? What would you recommend for somebody just like, how can they get involved? Somebody starting out. Obviously, I think that the barrier to entry is getting lower and lower now to things that in the past you have to be an expert or somewhat understand. Now with the AI platforms, the vibe coding phenomenon, you can get started very quickly. How would you recommend for people to get started with FHIR?
Well, there's a myriad of ways to get engaged depending on who you are. You're a techie, you can pick an open source, the open source frameworks or libraries or server frameworks or open source clients and contribute to that, or you can come hang out on chat.fire.org and there's no entry fee or entry registration or anything. I don't really know who is in the FHIR community because no one has to say I am or I aren't. And if you're a clinician, that's a bit harder because it's kind of hard for them to engage. And we've got, clinical groups, active meeting clinicians, and I'm really looking to wind that part up because we certainly need more clinically experienced participants. I mean, the ideal participant is me, or people like me and Josh and many others in the community who are both clinically qualified and sometimes experienced, and also experienced IT developers. We certainly have plenty of those, but you don't have to be experienced in IT. And then, so you can join the meetings. There's virtual meetings every week, hundreds, in excess of 100 every week at the different parts of the community that you can find out on chat.fire.org. Or you can come and attend, actually, starts costing money, come and attend, meetings, connect-a-thons, engage face-to-face. Those are the obvious ones that I off the top of my head.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you, Grahame, very much for this very insightful take.
I hope that the podcast goes well.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll do more of these in the future. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye.